Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's video is another linguistics ASMR installment. Today's topic is not a formalized field in linguistics. It's something a little bit different, and that's talking about the role that emoji play in language, specifically written language. A lot of linguistics focuses on spoken language, but with the advent of so many different kinds of communication over text, whether that's literal text messaging, emails, comment threads, so on and so forth, there have been a lot of new linguistic inventions. A lot of the content of today's talk is taken from this book, Because Internet, Understanding the New Rules of Language by Gretchen McCulloch, who is a linguist who studies language online. So she has a chapter all about emoji, and I've drawn a lot of inspiration from that chapter in preparing this talk, and then added a little bit extra. But if you're interested in diving more deeply into language in the internet, I recommend reading Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch. But let's go straight ahead and get to it. As I said, the topic of today's video is language and emoji, like this little guy right here. But specifically the role that emoji play in embodiment of language, and we'll talk more about what embodiment means. So, embodiment. What do you think the relationship between the mind and the body is? What's the relationship between the mind and the body? And in linguistics, what's the relationship between the body and how we use language? Not just maybe the more obvious aspects, like we use our mouths and our vocal tract to produce spoken language, we use our hands to produce signed language, but what else does the body do in communicating? Bodies play a critical role in language and communication, so things like gestures, eye gaze, stomping, grinning, rolling your eyes, all communicate something. So even just eye contact can do a lot in communication. And when someone's words and body language communicate different things, which one are you more likely to believe? If I say, I'm fine, but I cross my arms and I stomp my feet, are you going to believe my words, or are you going to believe my body language? And this embodiment of language is typically lost in written language, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. Embodiment and the relationship between the body and language plays a huge role in spoken language, but is something that we have difficulty communicating in written language. one form of embodiment is gesture. Gesture, as defined by Kendon, is visible action when it is used as an utterance or as part of an utterance. Co-speech gestures are gestures produced during the course of spoken language production. So they are not in place of speech, but they're just like what I'm doing right now. I'm talking with my hands, I might be pointing, I might be using gesture to emphasize what I'm saying. So it was this big or it was this tiny, using gesture to accompany spoken language, but not in place of spoken language. So anything you're doing, talking with your hands, is a co-speech gesture. There are some things that gesture is not. Gesture is not the same as a signed language because gesture is not language in and of itself. Gesture is not just pantomime. Gesture is not charades. Gesture is not fidgeting. If I have a fidget toy or I'm maybe shifting back and forth in my chair, that's not quite the same thing as gesture. And there are other motor actions that might take place during speech that are not quite the same thing as gesture. So if I'm talking to you and then I open a door because we're walking while talking, that's not a gesture. If I stop and tie my shoe, that's not a gesture. That's not necessarily a co-speech gesture. It's a motor action I might take while talking, but it's not the same thing as this talking with my hands kind of thing. There are also different kinds of signals we can represent with our bodies while speaking. These are called informative and communicative signals. Informative signals are actions that don't necessarily intend to communicate, but still tell others something. For example, taking a drink during a conversation informs our communication partner that we're thirsty, even though we're not necessarily intending to inform them of that. Whereas a communicative signal is part of our effort to communicate. So gesturing, gesturing like this is intentional. It's saying, I need a glass of water. I'm thirsty. It communicates taking a drink. So this gesture of like this communicates taking a drink and is part of our effort to communicate, whereas informative signals may give information to our conversation partners whether we intend to or not. And so informative signals are not necessarily gesture. Just like we said, gesturing is talking with your hands, pointing, doing that cup motion, something like that. But just taking a glass of water is not a gesture, but it is a signal, if that makes any sense. As we get into types of gestures, there are a couple different types of gesture. One is interactive. These help to manage dialogue. So these things indicate turn taking, indicate who has the floor, meaning that it is their turn to speak, that our attention is on them. It shows that someone is listening or elicits feedback. So these are often more of those unconscious signals, things like talking with your hands, eye contact, eye gaze, help manage turn taking and manage the flow of conversation, and they often happen without us really thinking about them. Representational gestures communicate something about the topic of the utterance. So we could have didactic gestures, such as pointing, that are understood in context. They could depict properties of an object, an action, or scene. So going back to, I caught a fish and it was this big, or I saw a kitten, it was this tiny, it was teeny tiny. They help depict properties of an object, action, or scene. And then emblems mean what they mean due to some convention in the speech community. So remember when we talked about the peace sign in an earlier video. Now there's nothing specific about this gesture that has to mean peace, but we have conventionalized it. It has become an emblematic gesture because of the way that it's been conventionalized in a specific community. So let's talk a little bit about emblems. Emblems, or emblematic gestures, have conventionalized frozen forms. They vary culturally and have subtle but obvious differences. They are almost always performed deliberately. So unlike some of those other gestures that we may do unconsciously, emblems are almost always performed deliberately, and they are often, but not always, nameable. So let's look at this specific emblem. It is always performed with the arms raised and the palms facing up. It is culturally sensitive, so it may not mean the same thing everywhere. It is performed deliberately, and it is nameable. The name of this gesture is a shrug. And so when we talk about emblems having frozen forms, what that means is that they have to be performed in a specific way for them to be understood as that emblem. For example, if I shrug, I will always shrug like this. I will not shrug like this. Or I will not shrug like this. Like, if you're not watching this because it's ASMR and your phone is facing down, when you shrug, your shoulders are raised, your palms are facing up, your hands are open. You don't shrug with closed fists. You don't shrug with your palms facing down. You don't shrug at waist level. It's always performed the same way. Same with the peace sign. It's always two fingers, palms facing forward. The fingers aren't bent. It's always the ring finger it's always the pointer finger and the middle finger. You would never do a peace sign with your pinky and your ring finger. They have frozen forms. They have to be performed the same way every time. So let's go back to emoji and how we use emoji. So let's look at this example of emoji as language. Imagine this text message exchange. One guy says, "Dude, let's rob a bank. Let's rob a bank." And then there's this whole emoji conversation playing out. Okay, we go to the bank, we steal the money. We're happy. No, the cops are on their way. We're scared. The cops get us. They bring us to jail. And then the other guy responds, "You're right, never mind." Is this how we use emoji in our day-to-day life? No, it's not. People usually do not use emoji and only emoji to tell stories or replace words one for one. So emoji are not used as one-to-one stand-ins for words. However, emoji do function as gesture. Emoji have a range of functions similar to that of gestures. Specifically, they're similar to that of emblems, nameable gestures with precise forms and reasonably stable meanings. A shrug is a shrug is a shrug. A crying face is a crying face is a crying face. There are a lot more similarities between emoji and gestures. One is that they are culturally specific. Obscene gestures function similarly to emoji with taboo meanings. They can have specific connotations and they can have dialectal differences. However, emoji are more limited in their ability to encapsulate visuospatial information. Emoji always take place on a 2D screen, whereas when I'm gesturing in a conversation, I can do it near my conversation partner. I can gesture towards my conversation partner. If we're having a group conversation, gesture can be intended for one person over another, and that's clear in spoken communication, but not in, say, like a group chat. So there are some differences in how communication is conveyed visuospatially between gestures in the real world and emoji. Now, many emoji are stand-ins for emblems, but not every emoji is emblematic. So, once again, emblems are frozen forms, they're culturally specific, and they're often performed deliberately. So emblem emoji are fairly specific emoji tied to a particular meaning. People may be frustrated if the emoji is wrong. So we've seen other people using it, we have a specific emoji in mind, and it has its more specific meaning. So this is less of an issue now, but in the earlier days of text messaging, there was a lot of variation between something as simple as a smiley face, whether you were texting on an iPhone or an Android, or you were on Microsoft, or you were on AOL instant messaging. And so something as simple as an emoji, as something as simple as a smiley face, could look really different, and it might distort the intended meaning. Whereas illustrative emoji highlight and reinforce existing meaning, and people are more willing to accept variation. So for example, illustrative emojis serve more as just a picture. They typically represent non-human objects, and they rely less on cultural interpretation. So let's look at the emoji for a birthday cake. You'll see on Microsoft it is a chocolate cake. On Apple it's a vanilla cake. On Facebook it's a strawberry pink cake. There's a lot of difference in how the birthday cake emoji is represented. However, this doesn't really cause a problem in meaning. The subtle differences between a chocolate cake and a vanilla cake are not as important when communicating the message happy birthday as something like open eyes or closed eyes are important when communicating a smiley message. So, once again, people do not typically use emoji as stand-in for words. Emoji stories are relatively rare, and emojis as substitutes for nouns are also relatively rare. So you can look at this example. I am in my car, not sure if I will be on time. The train was delayed and I was running away from police. It's okay now though. So things like car, train, running, police could be substituted with emojis, but they are not typically substituted with emoji when we look at text message data. What is more common is looking at emojis in combination. So the most common is pure repetition. So crying face, crying face, crying face, cry laughing, cry laughing, cry laughing. Complex repetition, where emoji of similar types are combined, or strings of thematically similar emojis, like party hat, gift, balloon, to represent like a celebration or a party. This is once again different from how words behave, but it is similar to gestures. We may perform the same gesture over and over, but we're less likely to just repeat the same word over and over in order to emphasize meaning. So those are some of the ways that emoji function similarly to gesture. Many emoji are emblematic and stand in for emblematic gestures, whereas some emoji are illustrative and may stand in for illustrative gestures. We can also look briefly at the history of emoji, or really just the history of pictures and words together. Let's go back all the way to medieval times and look at the manicule. Manicule had widespread use in medieval manuscripts and were used to call attention to a portion of the text. So in handwritten works, a manicule was just a little pointer finger that would indicate important pieces of text. Of course, other more elaborate drawings were also very common in medieval texts. Not just full-page illustrations, but kind of doodles along the margins that might either be related to the text at hand or could be completely unrelated as well. So drawing and adding little doodles, not just full illustrations, was very common when texts were still handwritten. Let's jump way ahead and look at ASCII art. It's called ASCII art because it uses ASCII characters, and this came into play once people had access to not just typewriters, but word processors and keyboards writ large. So they range from the more simple to the very complex, and they were little doodles that were made using just the characters you had available to you. From ASCII art, we get emoticons, which are composed of ASCII characters, and they vary in complexity, but the simplest are typically the most popular. Emoticons first appeared in 1982, and they are still used today. You'll see the smiley face, a heart, a frowny face. These are the sideways smiley faces, and they first appeared over 40 years ago, but they're still very much used today. Around the same time, cow emoji appeared in Japan 2 years later in 1984, and they can be a little bit more complex than emoticon, but you don't have to turn your head sideways, and there is typically greater emphasis on the eyes in cow emoji, and greater emphasis on the mouth in emoticons. So we have a shrug, we have TT, crying, a little happy smiley face. And so these were developed independently but at similar times in the West and in Japan. So to wrap it up, let's look at what emoji actually do. Emoji are not just the exact same thing as emotion. There are some similarities, but emoji don't have the spontaneity of facial expressions. You have to deliberately choose them from your keyboard. So instead, they cue intention. A smiley could indicate happiness, but it could also indicate politeness. It could soften a harsh statement. It could turn an insult into tease, and all sort of other complex meanings. So just a simple smiley face. I prefer the closed eyes smiley face. I think it's a little bit cuter. But a smiley face and just smiling do not necessarily indicate the exact same thing, although they may have similar usages. Emoji, more than anything, add layers of meaning. They provide cues for appropriate interpretation for words. They add additional nuance that is hard to communicate in written language. And they can also signal active listening. So just as you might nod your head or smile or make eye contact in a spoken conversation to show that you are listening, you may send a thumbs up or a smiley face or a heart to indicate that you're still paying attention but don't necessarily have a response in a written conversation. And to wrap it up with a quote from McCulloch, emoji didn't succeed because they were a language. They succeeded because they're not a language. Rather than try to compete with words on their home turf, emoji added in a whole new system to represent a whole other layer of meaning. So, I hope this brief talk has maybe convinced you that emoji are not one-to-one stand-in for not only words, but general facial expressions or gestures. I hope I've convinced you that emoji are emblematic, just as we have emblematic gestures in the real world. And I'd love to know what your most used emojis are, what your favorite emojis are, and how you use emoji in conversation. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting, relaxing, or both. And for now, all I have to say is good night. Good night.